Hi everybody, happy to see you again here. We started with very instructions the first day and we have started to move to more practical approaches. Yesterday with pedagogical approaches, today with compositional practices. Continuing with this path, we are going now, I think it seems, going to empiricism, because the title of this session is Models of Music for Music Cognition and Beat Tracking. So let me introduce the first speaker, Mr. Noah Fram, who is so going to talk to us about surprisal, liking, and musical effect.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. So, I'm going to be talking about some computational modeling that I'm working on in music cognition and perception, specifically with this relationship between surprisal liking and musical affect, as you can see on the screen. So before I get into the model that I'm working with, I want to provide a couple of examples of the kind of thing that I'm looking at modeling. I'm going to start with a piece. This is Sibelius' Symphony No. 5, the very end of it. Are any of y'all familiar with this piece? Yes? All right. This is the very, very ending of it. I'm not going to make y'all sit through all the rest of it. This is Bernstein's version. It's long. So, we have expectations of a number of levels. We've got some that's generated by our experience with tonal harmony and the typical sonata form it's used in symphonies, so we kind of know where this piece is going, and then it's taking its own sweet time getting there. But we also have this expectation that's generated within the piece by this orchestration and these continuous smooth long tones that is then violated by this sequence of marcato, these 6 marcato dominant chords, leading to the final tonic that is very, very short. And so there's an expectation generated by the piece, then an expectation generated by these series of marcatos, and then finally your concluding point there. There's other types of expectation that you can have, as you'll see in this, don't start it again, this next video, which I'm just going to start and then I'll talk over it as it's going. So, for obvious reasons, this isn't going to interfere with my ability to speak much. So, yes, this is a performance of John Cage's 433. How many of y'all are familiar with this piece? Okay, cool. Yes. So here you have 2 different types of expectation. The first one is, we're all familiar with this piece of music. So we have an expectation generated by the piece itself, what we think is going to happen. The other one is you have a totally different set of expectations associated with the ensemble doing the performing. And here they're going through the tuning, and I promise there actually is sound. So. Where are you? So essentially what's happening here is that they started the piece, and if you could see my screen, you would see that they are all standing.
This is very meta.
Yes. This is most of the piece. So you have these 2 expectations that are in conflict, right? One of them is entirely extra music, and they're both extra musical to some extent, but one of them is extra musical completely, and that it has to do with the ensemble itself. giving this thrilling performance. I'm mostly going to be concerned with the types from the first video, but I'll explain why later on. So, before I get into that, I need to talk a little bit about what I mean by expectation. Ever since 1956, with Leonard Meyer's book on emotion in music, we've had this idea of psychological theory of emotion, where our affective responses to stimuli are connected to violations of expectations that we construct. And the question is, how do we construct it, and can we model that? And there are a lot of approaches to this. Eugene Naumer's implication realization theory from the late 80s, early 90s separated expectation to these higher-level representative schema and bottom-up, which I've called physical expectation, which has to do with the sequences in the piece itself. Dr. Mazzola mentioned Steve Larson's theory of musical forces, like gravity, the idea that pitches descend, magnetism is resolution, inertia, melodic sequences tend to continue in the same direction that they started off in. Elizabeth Margulis has another quasi-physical theory that has to do with different kinds of tension, and more recently work out of labs from Pat Agris, Samar Abdallah, and Marcus Pierce has correlated expectedness with ideas of information context, which is sort of bringing in David Temperley's probabilistic models of musical structure. All these things are useful. I'm going to be primarily concerned with the theories at the bottom, but the basic structure that I'm using is more in line with Dave Huron's theory, the ITPRA theory from speed anticipation. One of the things he does is he divides expectation into four varieties. Schematic, which is these generalized representations of how this type of music proceeds. Veridical, which is specific to the work, as we saw in the John Cage. Conscious or extra-musical, which is details about the ensemble that's doing the performing, the context in which the performance is happening, and so on. And then dynamic expectations, which are within the work itself. I'm primarily concerned with the first and the last, with schematic and dynamic. And that's because conscious expectation is really difficult to model from a musical signal. You don't actually have access to all the extra musical data that you need. Veridical expectation definitely comes out of this model, and I think in its final stages, in its final incarnation, I guess, veridical expectation would also be included. But for this point, it's sort of focusing on these higher-level representations and then the lower-level schema. And that's because of this. So the colors are a little washed out here. This is a visual cortex representation of the complementary learning systems theory. This came out of the mid-90s with some work by Jay McClelland and others. And basically what it says is that whenever you encounter a new signal, you process it first in your hippocampus, getting at these sort of physical, like the dynamic expectation, and then you compare it to higher-level representations in your neocortex. And here this is a visual thing, so you're looking at the visual cortex and then the motor and premotor cortices. But it's the exact same phenomenon when you're looking at auditory cortex. So the ITPRA model breaks this down into a time series. So it says that as we encounter these events, so these 5 things that happen, we imagine what happens next, we make these predictions. Then as the stimulus gets closer, we prepare for the stimulus. This is the tension section. And then we have this predictive. That is all the pre-event epoch. The post-event epoch, everything that happens next, has to do with our assessment of the prediction, our immediate response to that, and then sort of a longer-term appraisal and readjustment of our standards. And we can see this happening in some neurological data. Okay. So we have these models of surprisal and expectation. What does this have to do with how much we like a piece? Well, that's where things like this come in. There's a theorized inverse U relationship between the overall complexity or surprisal of a piece of music and how much we like it. And this has been sort of established experimentally and works its way into a lot of computational models. There are two pretty fundamental issues with this sort of approach, though. The first one is that this is a population-level approach. So you can get this graph by adding up a bunch of monotone increasing and monotone decreasing curves. So it's not particularly good at representing what any individual does, just what a population as a whole does. And there's a bunch of research that goes into sort of describing why this is, but if you want to read about the distinctions of this, I might recommend Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, just because it gets into some of the same things with how it describes psychohistory, and it's very readable. Not that academic research isn't, of course, but I like science fiction. The second problem is that this has a mean subjective complexity measure for the entire piece. The music unfolds in time, right? So thinking about complexity as a measure of an entire piece is kind of like asking what pitch is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It's a weird way to generalize things. So we want to think about complexity as something, as a vector, as a time series, right? So That's what my model is getting at. I'm going to be using some canonical training methods, a combination of neural network, frequency statistics, and Bayesian inference in the final incarnation. This model is focusing on the Bayesian aspect. So I'm going to show you 3 instantiations of it. The first one is just a Bayesian diagram showing the overall inference structure. Then I'm going to get into the mathematics that underpin the inference steps. And then lastly, we'll talk about one implementation, and I'll show you the diagram of that and some of the results from that implementation. Fair warning, it's pretty rough. The implementation of it is, at least. And I'll talk about some of the issues with it at the end. So this is the basic inference structure. So a couple of things I want to point out about this is that the first step that happens is you're dealing with all these prior events, and you have to first infer how many categories you're looking at. I'm not assuming that music is something that we encounter, that we experience holistically, like music is a unit, but that we do have these sort of subcategories of music. You can call them styles, you can call them genres, depending on what camp you're in. You could talk about genres for a while. It's a whole other presentation, though. So the first thing you need to do is say, what kind of music am I looking at here? And then once you've determined your kind of music, then you can compute this long-term based sort of top-down prediction of what happens next. For this presentation, I use intrinsic and extrinsic with respect to the listener, not the music. So when I talk about an intrinsic expectation, I'm talking about what expectations do I bring to the table, what are my priors, and extrinsic is what am I getting from the piece of music. This also computes directly this extrinsic short-term model, and then I perform this hierarchical choice, which is essentially a weighting on these 2 expectations to produce my expectation for what happens next. Once I get that next event, I then compute its surprisal, and this surprisal happens at every single time throughout the piece. So I end up with a vector that's a surprisal vector that I'll then use to generate my liking. One thing that will come up several times is I'm deliberately agnostic about what an event is in music. And in part that's because I want to be able to vary that resolution, but in part that's also because as we listen to music, what we mean by events tends to change. So if I come over here to this piano, it's this song, and I just play this over and over again, it becomes 2 pieces of information, a D major triad and a repetition. Each of those chords isn't continuous. If I start doing this, right, I've got 2 chords and a repetition, but it's a pattern, so it takes a little bit longer to realize what that is. So at first, your chords are individual events, but after a while, each group of 5 becomes an event. So what I mean by event changes over the course of my perception.
Sorry, in the first example, you thought all the chords with the repetition as an event?
So
or 2 events, meaning that this one event is a chord, I mean the chord structure, and then the other one is the repetition.
Yeah, it's more like that. So that we have these incoming chords that every single time we encounter a new chord, we say, it's the same one I got before. So I'm not changing my representation of what happens in this piece until I see something new.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about this distinction between what a sensory event is and what a cognitive event is.
Okay.
Right? So some of the mathematics behind it. Essentially what's happening here is that you have this initial probability vector over the number of possible events. This is technically sampled from a flat Dirichlet prior, so I'm not making any assumptions on where the probability mass is concentrated. From here, I can do conditional probabilities based on this initial probability vector to get my starting point. Everything from here on out is going to be probability of event given context. The value for surprisal that I'm using is an instantiation of cross entropy. It's from Temperley's Musical Probability book from 2007. For the sequence of however my first sequence of events is, and then I update it by minimizing that cross entropy on this is my sequence of events, this is my conditional probabilities. So I minimize that cross entropy by varying my conditional probability distribution to within some tolerance. So that tolerance is important. That's what this is. So I just use a Mahalanobis style distance between probability distributions to keep it within some range. And the reason I'm doing that is because our representations of what happens are kind of sticky. So they don't, we want to be able to change them, but not extremely quickly. It's more of a force, more of a pressure in some direction than it is just a switch. Yes?
We get your conditional probability. Can you explain it a bit?
Okay. So this is a product of all these probabilities. This is a conditional statement. It's a weird notation. So essentially, what I'm saying is that for this initial probability will come out being virtually the same as this other one. I have to go back and re-put myself the specifics of the notation that I used there, honestly. But all that that is it's saying that for this condition, for this set, I'm going to take the product of every single probability of my vector.
And
Yes.
does the law will change or it stays the same?
Since that's my P naught, that's my initial, that's a constant. So that's my starting point for this training sequence. And then this will modify it, so I get a sequence of probability distributions. The top-down model, the intrinsic model, is kind of the same, except at the beginning here, I do this exact same thing, except the first thing that I'm doing is I'm sampling my number of categories. So again, starting from flat theoretically prior, this is conditioned on my number of categories being smaller. So it's placing an upper bound on my number of categories, number of possible categories. The most categories I can get is the number of sequences I've received. Because if I've only heard 3 pieces of music, I can't put it into 4 different categories, right? So that's my cap here. And then this is creating a distribution over the possible number of categories, and this is my expected value for the number of categories. So here, I pick a category by minimizing the surprisal of my piece over the categories I've constructed. If there are too many categories, then I have to take my 2 last ones, or my least likely ones, and just average them together to get a new probability distribution. So you can decrease the number of categories, or you can increase them. And then I update the distribution of that specific category, again, using cross-entropy with this tolerance. So,
can I ask?
Yes.
Sorry. So can you come up with a new category which is just generated by your actual experience?
Yes, absolutely. So that's what happens up here with this additional one. So each time you have a new experience coming in, you're basically adding on another dimension to my Dirichlet prior. So I can generate a new category. It's as you get more categories, it becomes less and less likely that you generate more. Okay, yes?
You're minimizing the cross entropy by choosing a category?
So
How are you
here, there's 2 different minimizations. Here, yes, I'm minimizing cross entropy by choosing a category. Here, I'm minimizing the cross entropy within the chosen category by altering my probability distribution for that category.
Okay.
There's 2 minimization things happening. Okay. This is the implementation, and I tested it on Bach chorales, which was not a great choice. This was selected more based on availability than based on ecological validity, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. The implementation was performed in a probabilistic programming language designed by Noah Goodman called Bud People. This is all a group. It uses 2 different types of inference. This first one was Markov chain Monte Carlo, and the second one was a combination of variational inference and straight up probabilistic enumeration. This has 2 differences from the model that I previously proposed. The first one is that my intrinsic model is trained offline, not online, and there's a couple of reasons for this, but the biggest one is if you train it online, then the order with which you train becomes itself variable. And I wasn't assuming any kind of order. The next step for this is ordered by year, just like with pop songs or something like that. But since I'm working with something that's so far in the past, I couldn't assume that there was a specific order to it. And the second one was just technical. I just ran into some roadblocks with getting it to work otherwise. So what I used here were melodies from Bach chorales, and I'll talk more about some of the issues with that data set later on. But what this produced were a bunch of surprisal vectors that I then resampled to have the same number of onsets, so just using upsampling, and clustered using dynamic time warping, distance between them, and Ward's algorithm to produce a graph that looks kind of like this. So you can see there are some definite higher level categorization things happening. If you use a cutoff for the DTW distance of 50 and plot the deviation of the play count on Spotify from the expected play count, to get a graph that looks kind of like this. So what we're looking at here is that even with this extremely flawed model, you can see distinctions based on these categories in the variability in the play count. So I'm just looking at the distribution of the spread as opposed to the specific location. What that implies is that this very flawed implementation of surprises seems to be capturing some aspect of arousal rather than valence. So are you all familiar with the arousal and valence distinction of affective response? Okay. Basically, I'm looking for a whiteboard and marker, but it's okay. Basically, the idea is that affective responses have two parameters. It can be parameterized roughly into a two-dimensional space. So one dimension is valence, or is this a good feeling or a bad feeling? And the other one is arousal, which is how strong is this feeling? So what this would imply here, my interpretation of this would be that these two categories have, there's roughly a similar variation in valence, which would count for the positive versus negative, all of these are centered around zero. But that these two categories have much more variation in arousal, so how much is this thing felt, especially on the positive end. And I admit that this interpretation is a little bit of a stretch, but there are, I think that there's also theoretical rationale behind that kind of an interpretation. So, where to go from here? Well, there's a few theoretical implications. The first one is what I just talked about. But the thing that I want to clarify at the beginning is that another thing we got out of this is that surprisal isn't enough. At least this instantiation of surprisal isn't enough. So we need to have multiple parameters coming in. The second one, though, is that there is some validity, some variation that you would see for this classification by surprisal vectors. And the third one is that the problems that I mentioned with the inference construction matter. So we need to have online training for it to be a valid psychological process, which means that the order and context of these exposures matters. So there's a lot more parameters that you can get at, again, with this sort of conscious expectation of extra musical data. And then it's accessible just within musical sequences. There are some concerns with the implementation. I mentioned the inadequacies of the data set. We also need to have some care taken with behavioral correlates of liking. Using music consumption as a variable, or deviation from expected musical consumption, raises a whole bunch of other potential lurking variables, so I'd want to ideally do more of a direct behavioral psychophysical task. And the last one is that the online optimization and connected cognitive allocation requires this sort of resource rationality. Our brains have a limited amount of cognitive resources, and so the purpose behind the construction of these higher level representations is to basically represent the most data with the fewest neurons. So that's what's happening here. And in order to do that effectively, the musical sequence needs to be fed through some first set of things to sort of pare it down into a more effective representation for the Bayesian approach, which is looking at the output, this higher level order, this sort of higher level model. So the next steps that I have planned are combining all of this into a single inference procedure and hopefully using a first step that's more of a neural network approach to infer the symbolic data that I'm using directly from an auditory signal. Again, fairly agnostic about what symbols are. This might be inferring musical events as opposed to symbols. The second one is acquiring a more precise measure of liking and changing my data set to something that has more ecological validity. And the third one is combining with some of my other extant work, specifically on spiking neural network models of the auditory pathway, computational modeling of syncopation and meter, and then computational modeling of musical similarity from the genre theoretic standpoint. That is all I've got. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noam. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, it was really interesting. I think it can be really linked in math to the filtration, we'll define it quickly, filtration of random processes, what you're saying, with all your laws which are changing and so on. So basically, filtration is the accumulation that you get of the past of a process, and you're always guessing like how will it go after. So I think that mathematically speaking, we have really complex random variable, a big one with a really complex space of state, and it would be really nice to put it, I think, in math, but I think we need to explain it after, because I'm not really understanding where it takes, what is the space of state. So, voilà.
What is the specifics of the probability distribution?
Yeah, like if when you're speaking about like measure changing in sound, it reminds me like a Markov kernel, for instance, or that kind of stuff. And like you can have some convergence too with those kind of process. And how to say that? Like it can be like at a moment maybe when you accumulate enough information, you can be almost sure of what you will have. I mean, you have this kind of result in fluctuation theory, and it's super linked to what you said. So I think that would be a nice way to do.
Yeah, that's a really good thought. Yeah, I think I will have to look into applications of filtration theory with the holistic stuff. My specialty is not filtration, I'm a topologist. Yeah.
It's a bit also of topology. I mean, it's more measure theory with sigma algebra and so on. But if you are good in topology, it will not be a problem.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I have two questions. The first one is, so you use the Dirichlet distribution.
Yes.
Did you also consider using like a Dirichlet process to being like flexible for the number of cables?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And that was less. Okay, this is a limitation of web people in that it's designed to do specific kinds of probabilistic inference, and it doesn't include Dirichlet processes as natively as it includes sampling from Dirichlet primers.
Yeah, okay.
So that was a technical limitation.
Yeah. And the second question is, can you mathematically show that your inference approach converges to the posterior distribution?
Not right now.
Yeah, because I like usually so I didn't see this optimization using the cross entropy as a like a Bayesian inference algorithm that is shown to converge to the posterior.
Mm-hmm.
Did you try also maybe other things like Markov chain Monte Carlo or variation plays or something?
I did. So the first inference algorithm we're using actually is a Markov chain Monte Carlo. I'm just using cross entropy as the. Did I have to use cross entropy as the parameter for that? I think I did. But the second one is a different kind of inference that's also a Bayesian model specific on distributions, on like partial distribution differences. That's why I gravitated towards variational inference, and that would be my ideal probability. It's something that acts directly on probability distributions as opposed to acting on predictive data.
Could you say something about? I think I missed the connection between arousal and the standard deviation of what the plays on Spotify. What was
so going back to this gravity. That one. Okay. So this is play count deviation from the expected. The expected based on track listing in the CD, because there's a logarithmic decay or exponential decay in how much, because people will start the album and then get tired of Bach chorales because they're Bach chorales, and then stop playing the album. So I'm looking for deviation from that play count here. And what arousal is measuring is, doesn't say whether you like it or are more likely to listen to it again, or dislike it, or more likely to turn it off, but it does say how strongly you feel either of those things. So the idea here is that if there's more variation, if there's a wider spread, that there's more pressure to either turn it off because you hate it, or turn it or keep it playing or playing again. So, yeah.
Very neat.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay.
So can I made an observation, and I was just wondering if I can indulge in your opinion. That what you have presented here today seems that it has huge implications for music pedagogy at all levels of the curriculum. The scientific notion that listening is actually a subjective experience, which we all know that we actually don't teach it like that at all. So that means, to me, that theories of music need to represent the subjective experience of music taught and learned in that way. So meter and tonality they really need to, these theories need to reflect the subjective experience.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the subjectivity is part of why I chose the Bayesian framework, because the basis of Bayesian probability is that we assess our beliefs about what happens next. That's all sort of from our interpretation out. I think that I just agree. I think I don't know.
This is a big round of applause.
From the point of view of the improvisational music, would you tell me how to use this to create better solos?
I think what I might say,
in a compact way,
right.
in something that you will tell to musicians to use as a thumb rule for their intro stuff.
I think I might say that since surprisal is important, you also want to have, but it's a time series, you also want to have surprisal happen in surprising places. So building expectations and then violating those expectations in ways that aren't themselves predictable would be where I would go. So
all right, I suggest that this talk maybe could be a justification for some very dissonant structures that seems to be like problematic when analyzed from the point of view of algebra and those things, but in the cognition point of view, it seems to be like completely right.
Right.
Because I was thinking when you were talking about the altered scale, and it has a lot of tensions, over dominant chords, and how, for example, Michael Brecker plays in this scale. He plays that fragments of the scale in places where you are not used to.
Exactly. It's like dissonance, especially in an overall consonant context, can be really, really compelling. Or dissonant in those kind of unexpected places that you're talking about with Brecker. Yes. Yes. I would say that pedagogically that is exactly the direction to take this data.
Thanks. Just a very quick question. In the work of other peers, there is this partition of the past, present, and future,
Yes.
and there are various measures of entropy and mutual information to quantify surprise and so on. I think they are doing it from a frequent approach. I just want to know how does it compare to your results with
I am less familiar with that partitioning, less familiar with that specific research, I think. But based on what you had said, I think that I don't know how to answer that question at the moment. I have to do more reading. But
just a side comment, they are studying surprisal in the mid-density pieces of field class, like 1+1 and orbitals, some pieces which travel this more conscious.
yeah, I think they're both sort of explanations of why minimalism works, because we're building a really strong expectation for what happens next, and then even small violations, even violations that are not in and of themselves surprising, become surprising just because we have such a strong information of what happens down the road. So I think it's driving at exactly the same point, just using slightly different computational methods, frequentist versus Bayesian.
Thank you very much.